Hi there, everyone. I think we are expecting a couple of more people to attend, so we'll just give everyone another minute or so to arrive. Um, so, as this is for staff, this session is being recorded. So when we get towards the end and we've got maybe a space for like Q&A, I'll turn off the recording just so you feel like you've got a sort of confidential space to and ask any questions that you want to. Yes, we've got a couple of people online. We'll give it another minute and then we'll get started. Right, should we make a start? Over to you.
Fabulous, thank you. Hi everyone, my name's Sophia and we've got Liv as well, and we're going to be talking today about supporting young people who self-harm, and we work with Trafford Thrive in education.
So what we're
sorry, I
gonna
don't know whether someone just joined since Jane was just saying, but we're just recording today, so it can be shared afterwards, and we're going to do questions at the end, and we're going to turn off recording at that point.
So what we're going to be thinking about today is understanding what self-harm is, recognizing the signs that someone may be self-harming, consider how we can have conversations with young people about self-harm, exploring effective coping strategies, considering how we can reduce stresses and the impact of self-harm on them, thinking about how we can look after ourselves, and just to kind of add that having conversations about self-harm can feel quite daunting for professionals, and we can feel kind of unsure of where to start. So that's why it can be really helpful. Just another thing to note is that at the end of the kind of presentation today, we'll be sending out the slides and a toolkit that can be shared with young people if you find this useful.
Just to note that we do have our school and college information line, which all staff are welcome to contact us for advice. When we come to the questions at the end, it might be difficult for us to offer specific advice about specific young people in terms of protecting confidentiality. But if you do have queries about a specific young person that you're concerned about, then you can contact this for non-urgent advice, or there's the CAMHS duty team for more urgent questions or advice, and there's also the 24-hour crisis support line through NHS 111 if needed, and we'll send out information about this at the end as well.
So really important, looking after ourselves. Self-harm can be a really emotive subject, so it's kind of always important to make sure you're looking after yourself and take that time out if needed. Asking for support, and feel free to kind of leave and rejoin again if you kind of need that space. You can speak directly to us through the chat, which Jane will be monitoring, or email, as Sophia kind of previously said. And if there's something that might play on your mind afterwards, speaking to a colleague maybe, or the safeguarding lead, knowing kind of who you can go to. And this quote kind of just covers like, you've got to look after yourself to be able to look after other people as well.
So before we get into the webinar today, we'd just like to ask all of you how confident you are currently feeling in supporting young people who self-harm. We've got a scale there ranging from a green happy face to a red unhappy face, and that would give an indicator of how confident you're feeling. So if you're able to pop in the chat maybe which colour face you are, or giving yourself a rating out of 10 for how confident you're feeling in supporting young people. It would just be good to get a gauge of how you're feeling. And we're going to ask this at the end as well, just to monitor. So I can't see the chat. I've got the presentation that I'm sharing. So I don't know whether Jane, if you can see any, any comments.
Yeah, there's some people are rating themselves as purple and blue. Yeah, so around that purple and blue area at the moment.
Okay. Oh, that's really good to know. Thanks for that.
So if we're thinking about what self-harm is, self-harm is an act of someone deliberately harming themselves. It's a symptom of distress, not a disorder or an illness. Self-harm can include cutting, biting, burning, hitting, scratching, pulling hair, picking, head banging, use of ligatures, interfering with healing of an injury, and self-poisoning. However, this list isn't exhaustive. There's other things that can be come under the kind of term for self-harm as well. And it can range from minor injury to dangerous and life-threatening behaviour. But the most important things to note is that it's a deliberate act, symptom of distress, not a disorder. And yeah, it can be that minor or it can be severely dangerous as well.
So when we think about how prevalent self-harm is, it is becoming more common and has been doing for a number of years. The Mind website reports that over the course of somebody's lifetime, 1 in 10 people have reported self-harm, and 1 in 4 have experienced suicidal thoughts. We've got an iceberg analogy here, and that the section in the middle represents maybe the self-harm that presents to clinical services that we're aware about and are maybe actively seeking support. The tip of the iceberg is acknowledging the small correlation between the prevalence of self-harm and suicide. So there is that small correlation, but it doesn't mean that if somebody is self-harming that they'll definitely be having thoughts of suicide. But it's also really important to bear that in mind and consider when we're talking about self-harm. Underneath the iceberg, there's the area of people in the community who might not be presenting to clinical services. And it's just being mindful of that, especially kind of working in a school setting, that there may be young people that we do know about who are self-harming, but there may also be young people who haven't come forward. And we'll be talking a bit later in the slides about how we can support those young people that we might not actually even know are self-harming.
So stigma can play a really big part in whether young people will access support or tell someone that they're struggling. There can be a lot of guilt and shame involved for young people and families. So it's really important to be mindful and sensitive of this. How we react and judge will kind of influence whether young people will seek support in the future. So it's really important to be mindful of this. We might have used kind of terminology such as attention seeking, but it's really important to try and kind of steer away from this. As young people might have different functions and purpose of self-harm, one of these kind of might be to elicit care from others. So kind of instead of saying attention seeking, maybe reframing it and thinking it more of eliciting care. Important to kind of move away from this stigmatizing of self-harm. With self-harm and suicidal behaviors can kind of come in trends and can be times where it's significant. Lots of young people kind of self-harm at the same time, and it can often be seen as copying. So we want to kind of dispel the myth and think about it in a different way. What we know about young people in the teenager brain kind of development is that they will learn from their peers rather than the adults around them. So if a young person is in distress, it's not unusual for them to kind of look around and see what other young people are doing to cope with this distress. And it can really explain why we see these kind of clusters of behaviour.
So when thinking about self-harm, we've put a slide here about what to look out for. It might be that, when we're thinking about those young people who aren't presenting as self-harming, but maybe, it's important to just be looking out for any changes that we might notice. So these changes might include physical changes, so unexplained cuts or burns, noticing that there's bloody tissues in waste bins, maybe flinching when they're being physically touched, which might indicate that they're in pain in some way. It's important to bear in mind that self-harm cuts do present differently to, say, a cut from a pet or something like that. So it's just being mindful that if a young person has another explanation for why they might have cuts on their arm, it's just having a look at the patterns of them and be mindful that it might be self-harm. Looking out for behavioural changes, so keeping themselves covered, maybe avoiding swimming or changing around other people. They might be accessing inappropriate websites or moving their phone out of the way, or more secretive behaviour. They might be doing things like not wanting to take their blazer off in the summer. These aren't indicators that there would definitely be self-harm, but they're just behaviours that we might notice if somebody is self-harming. And also be mindful of emotional changes, so being withdrawn or isolated from people around them, presenting as having low mood or lack of interest in things. It can also present as anger as well, or low self-esteem. And it's looking out for if young people are maybe blaming themselves for difficulties, expressing feelings of failure or hopelessness is quite an important thing to look out for, especially when a young person is really in distress. So just some things to be bearing in mind.
So we like to kind of use a stress bucket to understand kind of the self-harm cycle, as self-harm can be used as what we call like a problematic coping strategy. So if we imagine we have a bucket that we carry around and it slowly fills up kind of when we're feeling stressed. And examples of this stress could be, for young people, could be kind of things like friendship difficulties, exam stress, difficulties at home, sensory overload, lack of sleep, dealing with change, etc. The list can kind of go on, and it's really different and looks different for all young people and everyone. But if we notice these stresses happening over the day, it kind of might prevent it from overflowing, which decreases the likelihood of us feeling overwhelmed. And then we can kind of like add to this tap. So good coping is like that tap working, so it kind of releasing the stress and the water out of the bucket, and bad coping is the tap kind of not working, so the water's filling up and overflowing.
So to continue looking at the self-harm cycle, what we can sometimes see is that self-harm can bring a short-term sense of relief to distress, but then what can happen is it can cause additional guilt and shame, which can then add further into their bucket of stress, and kind of can add to that stress in the long term, which is where we can sometimes see an increase of self-harm. We know that self-harm can become habitual as well, and that can sometimes happen if alternative or better coping strategies aren't developed. So it's about supporting young people to break that cycle and help them to develop some more positive coping strategies that maybe aren't causing harm to themselves. Really understanding what the function of their self-harm is and why they might be doing that, which we can think about in terms of some strategies a bit later on in the slides.
So we're just going to watch a video, it's produced by Young Minds, and it was co-created with young people, so it's kind of a really nice video to understand it from the young person's perspective, and it's for young people and talks about the cycle of self-harm and how young people have felt when they have been kind of able to open up to someone.
You probably feel better at the time, but then the guilt sets in, then it's just a cycle, because it never really makes the emotion go away. Although it's a coping mechanism, it's very much like in the moment, and I did feel more isolated because I wasn't able to tell anyone for quite a while, and I started to feel quite lonely. It's not something you really want to admit, that you've got so low that you're having to resort to something like that, because there's lots of stigma around self-harm. No one noticed, like I probably could have not told anyone ever and kept it like quiet. So when I started being able to open up to people, it did make a massive difference, because talking about it is much more positive than actually doing it.
It was kind of a relief that I'd spoken to somebody about it. it's just the little small things that can make a big impact. I was helped to find other ways in expressing myself without hurting myself. You find out different ways that you can get help and different places where you can go. It's a place where you can be heard in a space that you feel comfortable, that you could actually speak to professionals or people that you trust about it.
One of the most positive things is change. There are things that will make things better, and you just have to look for them. And if one thing doesn't work, that doesn't mean you should give up or you're not worth it. It means that there are other options which you haven't yet explored.
Getting help made me realise I'm not alone. I felt so alone, I felt so isolated, that having that help opened my eyes to the fact that I can get through it. And my most amazing thing is that I can take my negative experiences and turn them into something positive.
There we go. Thanks for watching that. So when we're thinking about supporting young people at school, we are thinking as well about that everyday magic that we're probably already doing without even realizing. It's offering that that time and comfort to young people, speaking about them in a positive regard, accepting who they are, and creating those moments where that trust is being built, where they have that space to being able to talk to somebody, just being there, being, you know, a member of staff that they're aware of, as somebody that they can go and speak to if they need to, and creating an open environment where it is, you know, young people feel that they can talk about if they're self-harming. So it's just being mindful of just that everyday magic that you're probably already doing, that can really make such a difference for young people.
Liv, I think you're on mute.
Sorry, I muted myself for that video then. Thanks, Jane. So when we're kind of thinking about having conversations about self-harm, it can be really tricky sometimes to know what to say. So here are kind of some ideas of what might be useful. So kind of staying calm. It can be really anxiety provoking for a young person discussing self-harm. So can easily kind of think maybe in the moment, can't easily kind of sometimes think what risk assessments we might need to do, what's the protocol, but it's really important to kind of stay present, listen to what the young person's saying, ask kind of open-ended questions rather than closed questions to elicit more information. So for example, can you tell me a little bit more about that? Really important to summarize what you kind of hear being said, and it's even more helpful and person-centered if you kind of use the young person's words when reflecting it back. So kind of something like, this is what I've heard you say. Is that right? Am I right in saying that? And then kind of saying the words that they kind of used. Helps also to help the young person process the information that's being said in the conversation. Ask how you can help. Young people can often feel powerless when professionals take over, so it's really important for them to help them stay in control and make them feel kind of sense of autonomy. Giving reassurance. So as we saw in the video, that the young girl kind of took a long time to tell someone, so it can really feel daunting for a young person. So there's always kind of saying things like, thank you for talking to me, and reassuring them that they've done the right thing. Silence can quite often go a long way. A lot of the time we'll want to kind of jump in, but the young person might still be thinking and processing what they're saying. They might not have finished, gives them that kind of extra thinking time. So kind of going at their pace. asking them, are they ready to move on? Listening to understand. Often we're thinking ahead of what to say next, but it's really important to, as I said before, stay present and listen. Be yourself. They've obviously come to you because they know you and they feel like they can trust you. So just kind of reinforcing that relationship that you've already got. Being patient. You may only kind of get small pieces of information at a time, and focusing on more than just the physical risk. Remember, it's a symptom of distress. So thinking about the bigger picture behind it.
When we're asking a young person about self-harm, or when a young person's coming in and talking to us about self-harm, it is really important to just ask about any suicidal thoughts or plans or intentions, thinking back to that iceberg. There isn't always, that might not always be what they're thinking about as well, but there is a small correlation, so it's really important to just check in on that. And it's really important to take any suicidal gestures or indicators really seriously. It's important to be using really clear and simple language when we're asking those questions. So there are some examples on there. So, have you been having thoughts about ending your life? And asking how intrusive and maybe how regular they're happening. It can be helpful to ask young people to use a scale of 0 to 10 on how strong those thoughts are for them. So 10 being, the strongest they've felt, and 0 being not at all. Just to kind of gauge how strong they are for the young person. It's important to check in if they've got any plans to act on any suicidal thoughts, and if they have a plan, and ask if they're willing to share that plan with you. And it's really important to be putting that young person first and really listening to how they're feeling and giving them that space. It's completely natural to be thinking about, managing that risk and the responsibility to, if anything needs sharing, things like that. But it's really important in those moments to just be present with that young person, and then think afterwards about what needs to be happening next.
Thinking about safety, most young people don't need to go to A&E, as this can really significantly add that further distress and trauma. Hospital kind of should only be accessed if there's medical treatment required. It's important to know that all instances of self-poisoning reported within 48 hours do require immediate treatment via A&E. So advising them to go, or asking parents to take them immediately. You can also call, as Zofia said before, the CAMHS duty line for advice on NHS 111 option 2, and there's more information at the end of the slides for this. Young people may require some first aid and self-care advice on how to keep their wound clean, to avoid things like infection. So it's about kind of talking this through with the young person, and like reassuring them when they might need kind of like medical assistance, and when they don't. So kind of familiarizing yourself with this.
I've included this in the slides. I'm not going to go into all the detail on it, and I have got a link at the end of the slides, which does go into this in a bit more detail. But it's basically a care pathway for self-harm, when we're assessing self-harm and trying to kind of think about next steps and what might need to be actioned following any disclosure of self-harm. In the link for this, there's some really, really good tips of, how to ask those questionnaires that can be given to a young person to help assess that risk, and like some kind of helpful do's and don'ts and things like that. So it's really worth having a look at that. There's a video that goes alongside it as well, just to go into that in a bit more detail. So feel free to have a look at that in your own time as well. But I just thought I'd include it in the slides, and just to bring your attention to it as something to have a bit of a further look at.
So this is something that we call a safety plan,